June 6, 1944. The dawn on the Normandy coast arrives with a chilling grayness. The air is thick with the smell of brined and unspoken, suffocating anxiety. Inside a concrete bunker designated wider stands Nest 60 to Resistance Nest 60 to overlooking the stretch of sand that would soon be known as Omaha Beach. 20-year-old Heinrich Severloh crouches in the shadows. He is just a farm boy from Lower Saxony. Only a few months ago, his hands knew the rough texture of agricultural tools. Now, his finger hovers near the trigger guard of a cold MG-40 machine gun. Severloh has never killed a human being. The thought had hardly crossed his mind, but the beach laid out before him has been engineered by his superiors into a vast, calculated death trap. On the range cards, spread across the common tables, every jagged rock, every tide line, and every undulation of the dunes has been marked. They know exactly where the tide will force men to cluster. They know exactly where the kill zones are. For 3 months, Severloh has stared at the sea. He has strung barbed wire, dug trenches, and calibrated his fields of fire. His officers have assured him that this is the Atlantic Wall, the extension of Hitler's will, impregnable and absolute. They have also told him about the enemy that might come from the water. The Americans, they said, are a decadent mob. They are soft and disciplined, obsessed with money, and incapable of the sacrifice required by total war. Even Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had declared that the first 24 hours would be decisive. If the enemy could be stopped on the beach, Germany would win. At 6:30, the morning mist still clings to the water. Severloh peers through the narrow embarre shore of his bunker. In that split second, his heart likely skips a beat. The horizon is no longer empty. It is solid steel. Hundreds, then thousands of ships slice through the gray waves. It looks less like a fleet and more like a moving city, pressing toward the shore with a suffocating weight. Above, the drone of aircraft engines coalesces into a low-frequency roar that shakes the very earth. In that moment, Severloh does not yet know that he is about to pull his trigger and begin a 9-hour storm of violence. Nor does he know that what he witnesses this morning is merely the violent climax. This story is not just about the blood on Omaha Beach. It is the story of how the German Army's perception of the American soldier collapsed from contempt to confusion to respect and finally to a terrifying awe. To understand the terror of this morning, we must win the clock back 18 months. We must go to the sun-baked deserts of North Africa. February 1943, Tunisia. The soldiers of the Afrika Corps are walking legends. They have spent 2 years brawling with the British across the sands of Libya and Egypt. They have mastered the art of survival in sandstorms and the delicate dance of tank warfare in the open desert. Led by the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, they have pushed to the gates of the Suez Canal. In the eyes of these veterans, war is a high art, and they are its masters. So, when word arrives that American troops have landed in Morocco and Algeria, the reaction in the German Mess Ends is not concern. It is amusement. It is disdain. One Lance Corporal from the 15th Panzer Division writes home with a casual arrogance. He writes, "We fought the army a few days ago and destroyed over 90 of their tanks. We will blow him and all his rabble to perdition." This wasn't just overconfidence. It was a deep-seated cultural bias. Nazi propaganda had spent years painting the United States as a mongrel nation, weakened by racial mixing and capitalism. They believed the US was incapable of producing the Germanic spirit required for soldiering. The prevailing view in the Wehrmacht was simple: the Americans were amateurs playing with guns. The Germans were the professionals. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 seemed to be divine confirmation of this arrogance. Rommel's steel tide crashed into the American lines, and the defense dissolved like wet paper. The Americans were unprepared. German tank crews watched through their sights with grim amusement. As American tanks burned and infantry fled in panic, American commanders lost control. Units were scattered across 30 miles of front, unable to support one another. Some soldiers had arrived at the front. Only days earlier, some had never fired a bazooka until they saw a German tank bearing down on them. To the Germans, it was a turkey shoot. Rommel, surveying the wreckage of American equipment and the lines of dejected prisoners, noted in his diary that the Americans were fundamentally flawed in their tactical thinking. They were years away from being competent soldiers. But then, on the fourth day of that rout, the battlefield shifted. The change was subtle at first. The Americans didn't dissolve completely. Their resistance suddenly stiffened. The artillery, previously sporadic, began to fall with devastating accuracy. Infantry units that had been broken regrouped. They dug in and fought back. Rommel had expected a chase. Instead, he found himself in a grinding fight. By February 22nd, Rommel made a decision that surprised his staff. He ordered a withdrawal, not because he was defeated, but because he sensed a change in the wind. He wrote a revised assessment that would haunt the German high command. The tactical conduct of the enemy defense had been first class. They had recovered very quickly. Recovered very quickly. That phrase would become the recurring nightmare for German commanders. They assumed the American army was glass brittle and easily shattered. They discovered instead that it was rubber capable of being compressed. Only two bounced back harder. What the Germans could not see was the machinery of change churning behind American lines. Heads rolled. General Fred, and all was fired. The aggressive George Patton took command. The American military was not burdened by centuries of tradition. They were pragmatists. If a tactic failed, they discarded it. If the British method worked, they stole it. If the German method was better, they copied it. Just weeks later, at El Gitta'ar, when the Germans tried to steamroll the Americans again, they hit a wall. The Americans didn't run. Their artillery shattered the panzer columns. The amateurs were learning at a terrifying speed. But back in the bunker at Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944, that lesson feels a lifetime away. Heinrich Severloh pulls the trigger. The MG-42, known as Hitler's Bustwa, begins to scream, with a rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute. The individual shots blur into a continuous, tearing roar. Below him, the beach becomes an abattoir. There is no cover, just sand, water, and men dying in the surf. Severloh fires until the barrel glows hot. He swaps it out with asbestos gloves, again and again. When the machine gun ammunition runs low, he picks up his carbine. He fires for hours. He estimates later that he fired over 12,000 rounds that morning. He watches the bodies pile up at the water's edge, rolling in the macabre rhythm of the tide. By all rights of warfare, the enemy should break. No army should be able to sustain this. But then, the thing happens that chills Severloh and every German defender on that coast to the bone. They keep coming. Landing craft are blown apart, and new ones emerge from the smoke. Men are cut down in rows, and fresh waves step over the bodies of their comrades to push forward. Entire units are annihilated, and new units take their place. A German officer from the 352nd Infantry Division later described the psychological collapse. We were told they would not fight, but they came across that beach into our guns. They kept coming. We killed them, and still they came. As the Americans gained a foothold, the Germans faced a second, crushing realization. This was a material schlacht, a battle of material on a scale they could not comprehend. The Germans watched in disbelief as the Allies towed massive, prefabricated artificial harbors across the English Channel. Where there was no port, the Americans simply built one out of steel and concrete. German officers, veterans of the frozen Russian front and the African deserts, stared at this logistical wizardry and realized they were fighting a force of nature. The contrast was demoralizing. The Wehrmacht was still moving supplies with horses. Their motor pools were a chaotic mix of German, Italian, French, and British vehicles, always lacking parts and fuel. The Americans? They seemed to have an infinite supply of everything. A captured German soldier, marching past the instant supply dumps rising on the beach, made an observation that became legendary. "I know how you defeated us. You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us, for a starving German infantryman. Overrunning an American position was like finding a gold mine. Chocolates, cigarettes, medical kits, fresh socks, ammunition. It was an abundance that broke the spirit more effectively than propaganda ever could. But if you think the Americans won solely because of supplies, you are missing the crucial evolution. As the war moved inland into the bocage, the hedgerow country of Normandy, the Americans revealed a new, terrifying trait: their speed of adaptation. The bocage was a defender's paradise. Ancient hedgerows, growing out of stone-hard earthen embankments, divided the countryside into a checkerboard of killing fields. Tanks couldn't climb them without exposing their underbellies. The Germans dug in, creating interlocking fields of fire. Initially, the Americans bled for every yard, but the American learning machine kicked into gear. A sergeant, or perhaps a mechanic, the origin is debated, had an idea. They salvaged the steel obstacles the Germans had placed on the beaches to stop the landing craft. They cut them up and welded them onto the front of Sherman tanks, creating massive steel teeth. These Rhino tanks didn't climb the hedges. They plowed through them, bursting through the earth like angry beasts, bringing heavy fire directly into the German rear. Within weeks, thousands of tanks were modified. The Germans, bound by rigid hierarchies where innovation moved slowly, were stunned by this grassroots ingenuity. And then there was the artillery. In the east, the Germans had faced the massed barrages of the Soviets. But the Americans brought something different: precision. They perfected time on target missions. Fire direction centers calculated the flight times of shells from multiple batteries miles apart so that every shell arrived at the target at the exact same second. For a German soldier in a foxhole, there was no warning, no building crescendo. One moment, silence. The next, total obliteration. And above them, the Piper Cub. The Germans called these small, slow observation planes their most hated enemy. They looked harmless, buzzing in circles. But the Germans learned that if a Cub saw you, hell would follow. Veteran soldiers learned to freeze like statues at the sound of a light engine. But the quality that truly terrified the veterans, the men who had fought the British and the Russians, was American aggression. Beware mocked veterans summed up the difference. The British were professional but cautious. They would stop to reorganize. The Russians were overwhelming but crude. The Americans were different. They combined the ferocity of the Russians with the organization of the British and added a unique, relentless drive. If other armies were ambushed, they sought cover and planned. If Americans were ambushed, they immediately unleashed a storm of firepower and counter-attacked. Relentless. That was the word German survivors used. The tempo never stopped. You held one attack, and they hit you from the flank. You destroyed a tank, and 3 more appeared. They accepted casualties that would stall other armies, and they kept moving forward. Yet, this ruthless enemy presented a final, confusing contradiction. Nazi propaganda had warned the soldiers that the Americans were gangsters, brutal and vengeful. But when German soldiers finally raised their hands in surrender, expecting a bullet, they were often met with cigarettes. German officers were baffled to see American officers eating in the same chow lines as their enlisted men, joking with them. This lack of rigid hierarchy, which the Prussians thought was a weakness, produced soldiers who fought with initiative. This enemy, who could obliterate a landscape with artillery and then offer a prisoner a chocolate bar, created a cognitive dissonance that shattered the German worldview. December 1944. The Ardennes. Hitler rolls the dice one last time. Operation Walked am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge. He gathers the last reserves of the Reich. 200,000 men, nearly 1,000 tanks. Relying on heavy fog to ground the Allied Air Force, they strike the Ghost Front, a quiet sector held by tired and inexperienced American troops. Initially, it works. The American line is ripped open. Thousands surrender. The 106th Infantry Division loses to regiments. Panic spreads. German commandos in American uniforms cut wires and change road signs. For a moment, the old stereotype of the soft American seems to return. But then the spring snaps back. At the crossroads town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division is surrounded. They have no winter clothes, low ammunition, and are cut off in freezing snow. When the German commander demands their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony Micot sends back a one-word reply that has echoed through history nuts. That single word told the Germans everything they needed to know. You can kill them, but you cannot make them quit. Simultaneously, General Patton executes a logistical miracle, turning his Third Army 90 degrees and driving them 150 miles through blizzards to break the siege. When the skies clear and the American Air Force returns, the German offensive is pulverized. By January, Germany has lost its last 100,000 irreplaceable men. A captured German panzer commander, staring at the endless columns of American reinforcements, is asked what he thinks. He replies simply, "What is the point in this? I have a wife and children." The question contained the answer. Resistance against such a force was no longer war, it was suicide. The final chapter of this transformation happens not on the battlefield, but in the mind. Hundreds of thousands of German POWs are shipped to the United States. There, they experience a reality that defies everything they were told. Gunter Graw, a young prisoner, recalls being paid for his labor, eating better food than he ever saw in the Wehrmacht, and standing in a camp store deciding between ice cream and Coca minus Cola. They found a land of abundance, but also a land of unexpected humanity. They played soccer, formed orchestras, and worked on American farms where they were treated not as monsters, but as men. They realized that the decadent America of Nazi propaganda was a lie. They had been defeated by a nation that was not only industrially superior, but morally confident. And finally, we return to Heinrich Severloh. The machine gunner of Omaha Beach survived the war. He went back to his farm, trying to bury the memories of June 6th, but the ghosts of the gray beach haunted his sleep. Decades later, in 2004, an old man traveled back to Normandy. There, Severloh met David Silva, an American veteran who had been wounded on the sands of Omaha Beach, perhaps by Severloh's own gun. 60 years after they tried to kill each other, the two men embraced. They wept. In that embrace, the transformation was complete. From the sneering contempt of the North African desert to the shock of the Normandy beaches. From the stubborn snows of the Bulge to the ice cream of the POW camps, the German soldier learned a hard lesson. He learned that the American was not soft. He learned that the American could fight with a ferocity that matched his own. And most importantly, he learned that the enemy across the line was human, formidable, and in the end victorious. This concludes the long journey from arrogance to respect, etched forever into the sands of history. If you found this breakdown of battlefield psychology fascinating and want to uncover more lost chapters of history, smash that like button and subscribe. I am your strategy observer. I will see you on the next battlefield.